I always thought humiliation had an audible component. That night, it was the delicate, sharp sound of silverware striking the ceramic dinner plate, followed by the soft, muffled laugh that was not intended for my ears, but reached them anyway. This was the specific kind of laugh people produce when they genuinely believe you are too ineffectual or docile to offer any meaningful resistance. I had barely settled into my designated spot at the extensive walnut dining table when my brother Caleb crossed his arms and settled deeper into his chair, wearing the predictable condescending grin he always deployed right before delivering a calculated verbal attack. The atmosphere instantly solidified into a painful quiet, save for the gentle flicker of the expensive tapered candles. "Still living off Dad's money?" he demanded, raising his voice just enough to ensure every person seated could overhear the question. The younger cousins situated further down the long table snickered predictably. Linda, my stepmother, smoothly adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, a gesture of impeccable bored refinement. My father deliberately did not lift his gaze from his half-eaten dinner. He continued slicing into his perfectly cooked steak, then stated matter-of-factly, "Next month you should find your own place, Grace." I dismissed the bait, reminding them that 3 solid years of rent payments had been entirely my own responsibility was pointless. No one required an accounting of the late nights I had worked. I certainly wouldn't mention the tech company I had successfully built. Reciting the list of contracts I had already signed was useless. The truth was, none of them had ever inquired. I reached out, picked up my unused napkin, and placed it neatly beside my plate before I stood up. Across the room, chairs made a grating, high-pitched noise as they scraped against the polished hardwood floor. Somebody whispered the word drama, low enough to be clearly insulting, but high enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Rachel." My cousin rolled her eyes conspicuously at her husband, seated next to her. "Grace, please sit down," my father commanded, his tone flat. A soft refusal was all I offered. "I think I'll pass on dessert tonight." The heavy oak door clicked shut with a decisive finality behind me. Outside, the severe February cold immediately struck my face, drawing the heat away from my skin. Chicago in the middle of winter is unforgiving. I regretted not bringing a much heavier coat because I had not made any plans to exit the house this early. My car was unfortunately parked at the extreme end of the very long driveway. I began walking rapidly, plumes of breath coming out in small, dense white clouds before disappearing into the night air. The subsequent 20-minute drive home passed without incident. Foregoing the radio, I preferred the oppressive silence. The lack of noise should have offered me some kind of mental reprieve, yet it failed completely. Their words continuously repeated themselves inside my head. Caleb's self-satisfied grin was a loop. The dismissal in my father's voice resonated with the clink of silverware. Linda's careful presentation of neutrality, her habit of always directing her attention just past me whenever I attempted to speak, was infuriatingly clear. Entering my apartment, I found it shrouded in darkness. The keyring dropped onto the kitchen counter with a loud sound. I stopped and leaned heavily against the granite kitchen island, still wearing my evening coat. A faint metallic click came from the radiator as the building heat cycled on. Through the closed window glass, the distant muffled traffic noise filtered in. This was the pattern for 28 years. I was the daughter who chose not to pursue the established, lucrative path of medicine like Caleb had. The one who failed to secure a socially advantageous marriage. I was the daughter who worked on computer stuff, a mysterious activity that nobody in the family unit understood, nor did they ever bother to care about understanding. Just then my phone buzzed briefly. It buzzed again. Immediately, a third time. Within moments, the vibrations became entirely continuous, so frequent and energetic that the device started to visibly slide across the smooth countertop by itself. I grabbed it fully, expecting my father's number to dominate the screen. Instead, the display showed a bizarre torrent of missed calls from completely unknown sources. New York area codes blinked rapidly. Boston, San Francisco, and a multitude of local Chicago numbers flashed. The sheer volume of notifications stacked so fast, the phone's operating system visibly froze for approximately 3 long seconds. When the display finally unstuck itself, I scrolled down to see the emails. Dozens of new messages were flooding the inbox. These were requests for formal statements. Interview requests were stacking up. Every single message requested an immediate public comment. A major news alert was fixed prominently at the very top of my lock screen, glowing a vivid, urgent red. Breaking news: Aurora Secure Systems achieves federal-level pilot status. Founder, Grace Miller. I forced myself to read the entire headline twice, slowly absorbing the words. It was my actual full name. My own company's name was next to it. That was the massive federal contract I had been diligently working toward for 18 months, the one that necessitated full security clearances, extensive background checks, and an endless stream of meticulous documentation. It was official. The proposal had successfully gone through the final approval stage. Someone, likely a government official or a contractor contact, had leaked the news prematurely to the press before I had even received the standard official call. The phone resumed its insistent physical buzzing. More strange, unknown numbers appeared. Then the familiar ones. My father's name, Caleb's, Linda's. Dad again, already a second time in minutes. A text message appeared from Caleb, written entirely in capital letters. "What did you do? Call now." A text from my father followed. "We need to talk, immediately." I placed the phone face up gently onto the soft fabric of the couch and watched the screen light up repeatedly. Call after call continued to arrive. The bright display never once went dark. Aurora Secure Systems. I had launched the business 4 years prior with only $12,000 of carefully saved cash and a single refurbished laptop computer. Initially, the focus was basic cybersecurity consulting for mid-size regional companies. That work expanded into larger, more lucrative contracts, which eventually led to government subcontracts. No one in my immediate family knew any of the operational details of the business. Whenever they inquired about my profession, I simply stated, tech consulting. Over time, they simply stopped asking. The scope of the federal pilot program completely changed the entire nature of the company. It dictated that Aurora's proprietary encryption protocols would be rigorously tested across a minimum of 3 critical government agencies. If the pilot successfully achieved all benchmarks, the resulting full contract was projected to be worth $47 million over a period of 5 years. This milestone was the culmination of 18 months spent in high-level meetings, comprehensive financial audits, and intensive security reviews. This information was now public knowledge. My father's number flashed brightly again. The call went unanswered. Instead, I accessed my email inbox. 63 new messages had arrived in the few minutes since I left the table. They were journalists from major financial and tech outlets, Bloomberg, Reuters, and TechCrunch. I noted messages from 2 prominent investment firms inquiring about the firm's plans for future funding rounds. One congratulatory note was from the Department of Homeland Security contact, who had personally guided the final contract approval process. The persistent phone rang once more. This time the screen showed Linda's name. I let that call proceed directly to voicemail. For 4 years, this family never demonstrated any curiosity about my actual work. The moment I had mentioned starting the company, my father responded with, "That's ambitious," using the exact inflection he reserved for what he considered thoroughly bad ideas. Caleb's only input was to ask if I required financial assistance. Then he laughed dismissively when I confirmed I did not. Linda had instantly steered the conversation toward discussing Rachel's wedding plans. Now their combined urgency was evident. All of them repeatedly sought contact. I finally picked up the device and scrolled through the extensive list of missed calls. 14 calls originated from Dad. 9 came from Caleb. Linda had contributed 6, and 3 had surprisingly come from Rachel, who had not initiated direct conversation with me in 2 years. A new text appeared from Caleb Grace. "This is serious. Call me back. Seriously." That single word was his only acknowledgement, as if my professional life only achieved the status of serious when the news media decided to acknowledge it. I powered down the ringer completely. Placing the phone face down on the coffee table, I allowed the lights to fade. The apartment settled back into its previous quiet state. I could hear the subtle, deep vibration of the building's main heating system running. A faint, distant sound of a television show leaked from the neighboring unit. These were normal, everyday sounds. I heard the identical sounds every single night upon returning from the office, but the objective facts surrounding the situation had radically shifted. 4 years ago, I began building Aurora in complete silence. No assistance was solicited from my family structure. There were 0 investors drawn from my father's influential social network. I received no professional introductions utilizing Caleb's medical school connections. I accomplished the work entirely alone, dedicating nights and weekends to the effort learning contract law fundamentals from online tutorial videos and mastering complex cybersecurity protocols through rigorous online courses. I had certainly made mistakes. The company nearly ran out of capital twice. I kept moving forward regardless of the obstacles. The fact remains, they had failed to notice any of it. They simply lacked the inclination to notice. Presently, they were desperate to converse. I stood and slowly walked toward the window pane. The sprawling city of Chicago spread out far below my vantage point, thousands of artificial lights scattered across the deep encroaching darkness. Somewhere out there in that light, reporters were actively writing stories about my fledgling company. Financial investors were making strategic calls, government officials were preparing their official public statements, and specifically in my father's expensive dining room, the family I had just left behind was undoubtedly struggling to process the news that the daughter they had so effortlessly dismissed had quietly built something substantial and real. My phone screen flared with light one final time. It was Dad. I watched his name glow fiercely for a few seconds before the light finally subsided. The logistics of tomorrow would be complex, calling back all media contacts. I needed to issue formal statements and immediately schedule mandatory high-stakes meetings. Handling the sudden, intense public attention required an immediate, comprehensive plan. Tonight, I remained standing at the window. The cold from the glass was a slight comfort. I permitted the silence to finally settle into the room. They had been afforded years to inquire about the nature of my work. They never took the opportunity. The world was now asking. I stood ready to provide the answer. I woke before the sun. The apartment still dim, the world outside wrapped in the kind of early morning quiet that feels almost fragile. My phone lay exactly where I had abandoned it the previous night, constantly congested with alerts. It continued vibrating every few minutes, an insistent refusal to acknowledge the night's definitive end. Reaching for the device was not my immediate action. I required a brief moment of absolute stillness before I would permit myself to dive into the profound consequences of achieving instant visibility. The central irony of the situation struck me immediately. I had spent years meticulously operating in silence, purposefully building Aurora secure systems from a scattered collection of ideas and carefully borrowed hours, genuinely believing invisibility offered the most robust path to safety. Now the entire world demanded immediate access to me, and the family who previously treated my existence like a simple footnote suddenly behaved as if they had misplaced something immeasurably valuable. The physical air inside the apartment felt perceptibly different that morning, almost as if the atmospheric pressure itself had drastically shifted. I began making coffee, permitting the kettle to hum its low sound, while my mind tirelessly retraced the exact path which had led me to this moment, every single late night spent in cramped, substandard workspaces, every line of code painstakingly stuffed between unrelated freelance jobs, every ignored invitation to the obligatory family gatherings, because I understood precisely how those painful evenings would inevitably conclude. I never constructed Aurora from a place of simple spite or malicious intent. However, the foundational layers beneath the company were unmistakably formed from a lifetime of relentless microaggressions of being consistently told I was inherently less than what I intrinsically knew I could become. Their sustained dismissal sharpened my abilities. Their unwavering favoritism toward Caleb hardened my resolve. Their constant reminders that I should express gratitude for the bare minimum instilled a crucial survival instinct rely on no one but myself. When I finally took hold of the phone, a fresh deluge of missed calls immediately greeted me. Dad's number flashed repeatedly. Caleb alternated between demanding an explanation and sending half-panicked messages. My stepmother Linda had even left a request asking me to touch base, using the precise corporate jargon she deployed exclusively for her interior design clients. I quickly skimmed past all of the family entries. A single voicemail message immediately captured my full attention. It originated not from the family, but was a clipped professional message. A woman with an unmistakable, crisp Boston accent identified herself as a deputy director within the Federal Infrastructure Compliance Bureau. She offered a concise congratulation, then directly requested that I organize a preliminary briefing within 24 hours. Her tone held no trace of skepticism, zero condescension, and absolutely no implied doubt regarding my capability. She spoke to me as an equal, acting as though I had always belonged in that world, like the immense fortified door to federal-level influence had permanently been meant for my passage. That professional difference alone settled an unsteady tremor deep inside me. I dressed rapidly, selecting simple black slacks and a slate gray sweater. These were clothes that deliberately failed to announce anything except competence and seriousness. The reflection staring back at me in the mirror showed a woman who looked significantly calmer than she currently felt. Underneath that quiet, composed exterior, the humiliating memory of the previous night's dinner still simmered intensely, especially the way Caleb had tilted his head smug and fully amused, acting as if my entire existence served purely as material for his commentary. It remained incredible to me that one published headline had so thoroughly flipped the massive dining table they had always comfortably sat at, while I was simply relegated to standing quietly on the periphery. The first professional call I chose to return was intentionally not directed toward any member of my immediate family. I rang May, my indispensable lead engineer. She picked up the line on the very first ring, her voice immediately alert. I saw the alert, Grace, she confirmed instantly. Are you doing all right? Good enough to operate, I replied, keeping my voice level. We will manage the coming wave, May. How is the back-end load holding up this morning? Stable, thankfully, she reported. The traffic spiked overnight exactly as predicted, but it did not stress the core system architecture. Our established auto-scaling protocols kicked in early and handled the load perfectly. Perfect. Keep the logs meticulously tight. We will require absolutely clean data for the upcoming federal pilot review, you know that. Already executed that task. She paused for a slight beat. Brace yourself for the massive press request, Grace. Reporters are circling the building aggressively. Let them circle, I instructed without emotion. They will not gain access unless I decide they should. She laughed softly into the phone, the distinct sound of someone who has personally witnessed the long, grueling nature of the ascent. It genuinely feels like it's finally your turn, doesn't it? Her simple words penetrated deeper than she could have ever known at that moment. Upon concluding our call, I immediately began the drive toward the office location. The building itself was neither conventionally tall nor architecturally sleek. It was actually a converted factory structure featuring exposed ceiling beams and notoriously long, constantly drafty hallways, but every inch of it belonged to me. My small team had initially worked at a bizarre collection of mismatched desks. Our essential whiteboards were borrowed from a local school auction, and our earliest servers hummed loudly behind a flimsy, repurposed metal door. Every single upgrade achieved since those lean days had been strictly earned through revenue, never simply gifted. I pushed forcefully through the primary glass entrance door. For a brief, comforting moment, the powerful smell of old, well-worn wood, mixed with the warm scent of concentrated circuitry, hit me with a completely familiar sense of ease. My entire staff was already gathered inside in small clusters, their voices deliberately low, their eyes shining with undeniable excitement. They immediately applauded when they caught sight of me. This was distinctly not the loud, performative kind of applause I vividly remembered from Caleb's insufferable graduation parties. This was significantly quieter, far steadier, and entirely filled with a mutual recognition that stemmed directly from surviving a grueling process together. Jared, our security lead, stepped forward from the small crowd. Congratulations, Grace. The pilot status is genuinely huge news. Thank you, Jared, I acknowledged. But note that this achievement does not change the core way we operate. We will remain rigorous. We will remain quiet. We will stay strictly focused on execution." "Understood," he confirmed. He then lowered his voice, dropping the volume significantly. "Are you fully prepared for whatever your family is about to throw at you?" Now, I did not immediately provide an answer to that loaded question. The underlying truth regarding my family was inherently complicated. They were certainly not dangerous in any physical immediate sense. Their particular brand of influence cut in significantly different ways. Small toxic comments intended to narrow my ambition. Subtle damning looks that constantly made me question my own internal capabilities, and whispered dismissive opinions that somehow carried far more detrimental weight than they should have been allowed. They had shaped my personality by slowly eroding my self-worth, never by offering genuine support. "I am ready for what actually matters to this company," I finally asserted. Jared simply nodded once. That confirmation was entirely sufficient for him. I walked steadily down the long hallway toward my isolated office, the consistent rhythm of my footsteps echoing clearly against the concrete floor. Inside the room, my desk was visibly piled high with urgent messages from partners, external agencies, and financial analysts who had collectively spent the past year pretending we did not exist. Overnight, Aurora had instantly transformed into the company they all suddenly craved proximity to. I efficiently sorted through the large stack of documents, marking what specifically required an immediate response and what could strategically wait until later. Halfway through the necessary task, my phone lit up once more. It was Dad. I allowed the phone to ring until it stopped. A text message followed immediately. "Call me this morning." Then a second more insistent text arrived. "This isn't a request, Grace." I placed the device face down on the desk. He had dedicated years of his life reminding me that I was inherently not exceptional. He had spent years instructing me to stay grounded, remain modest, and always stay strictly within my assigned corner. Now he suddenly demanded immediate unearned access to the version of me he had so deliberately refused to foresee. I opened my laptop and immediately shifted my focus exclusively to the complex federal scheduling requests. Work had always served as my most reliable anchor. It represented a universe of pure logic and measurable precision where absolutely no one cared about family hierarchy or the performance of holiday manners. Aurora existed today precisely because I had consistently refused to crumble under the constant weight of their judgment. 20 minutes later, May appeared silently in my office doorway. "The press is outside right now," she stated clearly. "I count 3 different camera crews and 2 field reporters. They are visibly hoping for a formal statement. Tell our security staff to keep them confined to the sidewalk immediately," I replied, my attention remaining fixed on the screen. "We are not issuing any statements to the public today," she acknowledged the instruction. "Also, there is a car illegally parked in the loading zone." I looked up from the screen. "Who is it?" She hesitated for a brief moment. "It is your father." A quiet but absolute rush rolled through my core. It was neither fear nor anger. It was instead a pure, cold certainty. He had completely failed to take the subtle hint. He never did. My father genuinely believed the world would fundamentally bend to his will when he simply leaned hard enough upon it. "Do not buzz him into the building," I instructed clearly. May held my gaze for a moment, visibly evaluating my decision, then nodded sharply and vanished back down the long hallway. I remained firmly seated at my desk, allowing the charged moment to fully settle. Years ago, a surprise visit of this nature from my father would have completely shattered my composure. His disappointment was always skilled at finding the weakest, most vulnerable parts of my psyche first. His prolonged silence felt perpetually like a crushing judgment. His rare approval felt intensely conditional. That specific toxic dynamic had shaped virtually every professional risk I had ever chosen to take, and every hesitation that had inevitably followed. But today, the established balance of power has irrevocably shifted. The immense influence he once wielded over my life entirely evaporated the precise moment the external world learned exactly who I was without requiring his presence. The intercom on my desk crackled suddenly to life. Jared's voice came through sounding strained. "Grace, he is currently insisting on coming inside the main building. Do not permit his entry. I responded calmly with perfect clarity. If he genuinely desires conversation, he can use the phone and call me just like everyone else must. A very long pause followed my statement, then a quiet, definitive, "Understood." The intercom clicked off into silence. I exhaled slowly, checking my pulse. My heartbeat remained steady, unaffected. I was not hiding from his presence. I felt absolutely no fear of him. I simply recognized that I did not owe him the explanation he had so thoroughly failed to earn. The remainder of the morning proceeded with controlled high intensity. Contracts were finalized, policy updates were reviewed, engineering evaluations were performed. A call with a key federal liaison ended with her stating plainly, "Your team has built something genuinely exceptional, Ms. Miller." Her tone carried deep, unforced respect, not a hint of surprise. That single sentiment felt like pure, invigorating oxygen. Around noon, I stepped briefly into the hallway and watched the midday sun spill across the concrete floor, illuminating the dust motes. The day felt fundamentally different, not because of the sudden public attention, but because I had finally allowed myself to accept a truth I had suppressed for decades. I did not require my family's belief for my reality to be absolutely true. They could remain standing outside the secured building. They could exhaust my voicemail capacity. They could continue to demand elaborate explanations. But the version of me they willfully ignored had entirely outgrown their limited reach. As I headed back into the security of my office, my phone vibrated again this time, not with a petulant demand or a parental reprimand, but with an official electronic notification from the Federal Infrastructure Compliance Bureau pilot, onboarding scheduled. Please confirm the leadership briefing. I pressed the confirm button without a single moment of hesitation. For the first time in my entire life, I was not waiting for conditional permission. I was moving. The memory surfaced without warning during a budget review 3 weeks after the federal announcement. One moment I was scanning quarterly projections. The next I was back in Dad's Chicago dining room, 23 years old, clutching a manila envelope stuffed with diagrams and early test results. That winter had been brutal. Wind cut through the city at 15 below, but the cold that night came from inside the house. I should be honest about something: my prototype was not perfect. The architecture had gaps I couldn't see yet. The compliance layer was theoretically sound, but untested under real pressure. I had built something promising, not something finished. At 23, I didn't know the difference. Dad had called the meeting himself. Unusual. He rarely summoned me for anything beyond errands or obligatory dinners designed to project family unity. I walked in hoping this time might be different. I rehearsed my pitch 17 times. I believed passion would compensate for the holes in my logic. I should have known better. The board members were already seated when I arrived. 4 men in tailored suits who greeted Caleb with firm handshakes and warm eye contact. They barely glanced in my direction. My stepmother offered a tight smile, the kind meant for guests she didn't want but couldn't dismiss. Caleb settled deeper into his chair with a bored air. Dad sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled the envelope I'd given him earlier resting untouched near his coffee cup. "Let's be efficient," he said. No greeting, no warmth, controlled authority wrapped in polite indifference. "We've reviewed your proposal." For 1 second, my lungs expanded. I imagined support, mentorship, recognition of the hours I'd poured into the design. I imagined Dad seeing me as capable. Then he continued, "It's not viable in its current form." The words landed like a verdict, not an invitation to improve. I opened my mouth, but he kept talking. "The numbers are superficial, projections overly optimistic. The architecture reads like something a graduate student might present at a career fair." One board member chuckled. Another suppressed a smile. I stood frozen. Something in my chest locked shut. "The system works," I managed. "You saw the efficiency metrics, the throughput data." Here is where I must be honest with myself even now. The efficiency metrics were real, but they came from controlled environments. I had never stress-tested the system against adversarial conditions. The throughput data looked impressive on paper, but I had cherry-picked the best results. I didn't lie, but I presented an incomplete truth. Dad nodded once, only to cut me off. "You lack leadership experience, No investment background, no credibility in this space. You understand theory, not execution. Innovation requires a foundation you simply don't have. Some of this was dismissive, some of it was accurate. I couldn't tell the difference then. I looked at Caleb. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch. He looked entertained, but also something else I refused to recognize at the time interested. He was actually reading my diagrams while I defended myself. Dad slid a second folder across the table. The room tilted. "This," he said, "is a practical path. Caleb will take over the project." My pulse hammered against my ribs. "He'll rebrand your prototype as seed technology for a new compliance division. He has the polish, the network, the judgment this requires." Caleb finally spoke. "The core concept is solid grace. The execution needs work. I can bring in people who know how to scale this properly." His tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was matter of fact, the way someone discusses acquiring an asset rather than stealing from a sibling. That made it worse. "You can't do this," I whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, a small voice asked, "Can they? Is my prototype really ready?" Would I have been able to answer investor questions I hadn't anticipated? Could I have navigated regulatory requirements? I barely understood. I silenced that voice. I had to. Doubt felt like betrayal. Dad didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. His tone carried decades of authority. "Caleb will make it workable. We'll credit you as a contributor." The insult cut deeper than the dismissal. A contributor? To my own invention, my algorithm, my data, my blueprint. But was it truly mine if it couldn't survive without their resources? Was ownership about creation or about execution? These questions would haunt me for years. The board nodded along a slow ripple of agreement moving around the table. One of them, Mr. Harrison, I still remember. His face paused before nodding. His hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds. I've wondered since then if he saw something the others didn't, if he recognized the theft for what it was, or if he simply had indigestion. Something inside me shifted then, not a dramatic shatter, a quiet fracture that changed the architecture of who I would become. "You don't get to erase me," I said, barely audible. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "No one is erasing you. We're trying to help you see that good ideas need infrastructure. You built something interesting. Let us build it into something real." The worst part, he might have believed what he was saying. Caleb wasn't a villain in his own story. He saw himself as the capable older brother stepping in to rescue a flawed project from a sister who wasn't ready. His condescension came wrapped in genuine belief that he was doing me a favor. That's harder to hate than pure malice. Pure malice is clean. This was murky. "I'll rebuild it myself," I said. Dad settled back, adjusting his collar. "Sweetheart, you don't rebuild anything without resources, without connections, without a name that carries weight." He paused. "You're talented. But talent without structure is just potential that never converts." He meant it as final, absolute. A door slamming shut. But buried inside his dismissal was an admission I didn't catch until years later he called me talented. It was the first time. I stepped away from the table. "You're going to regret this." Caleb's expression flickered, not amusement, something closer to discomfort. "Grace, don't leave like this. We can talk about your role going forward." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I left without my coat, without saying goodbye, without looking back. The cold air outside stung my face, but it didn't matter. Each step shook free another layer of expectation I'd carried for too long. By the time I reached my car, I was trembling from more than the wind. I wasn't just leaving a failed meeting. I was leaving the last version of myself who believed they might change. But I was also leaving behind something else, the chance to ask better questions, to demand specifics, to say, "Show me exactly where my architecture fails and let me fix it." Instead, I chose wounded pride over curiosity. I chose exile over negotiation. Would it have mattered? Probably not. Dad had already decided. Caleb had already positioned himself. The outcome was likely fixed before I walked through the door, but I'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty is its own kind of wound. I drove home, packed 2 suitcases. I gathered every notebook, backed up every file, secured the prototype in a friend's spare room, booked a one-way flight to Denver, cheap ticket, terrible departure time, no plan beyond survival, and the stubborn belief that my idea deserved life, even if my family refused to see it. What I didn't do, I didn't ask for a second meeting. I didn't request written feedback. I didn't offer to address their concerns point by point. I didn't try to find an ally in the room. I ran. Running was the right choice for my sanity. Whether it was the right choice for my prototype, I still don't know. Denver offered no comfort. The apartment I rented had rattling pipes, uneven floors, and radiators that hissed like they resented being used. I worked 3 jobs copywriting at night, calculus tutoring in the afternoons, hardware repair, wherever I could find it. I coded in the laundry room because the ventilation was better and the outlets didn't spark. But every night after the noise faded, I pulled out the prototype and tried to breathe life into the thing they said wasn't ready. And here's what I discovered: they weren't entirely wrong. The original compliance layer crashed under load. The encryption protocol had a vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. The user interface was functional, but hostile. The documentation was incomplete. The revenue model was optimistic to the point of fantasy. I spent 18 months fixing problems I should have found before that meeting. 18 months rebuilding an architecture that needed rebuilding. 18 months proving that my idea had merit while simultaneously proving that my execution had been flawed. This doesn't excuse what they did. Taking someone's work without consent is theft regardless of the work's imperfections. But understanding my own blind spots changed how I processed the betrayal. It transformed pure rage into something more complicated and more useful. Failure hit repeatedly. Each setback is harder than the last. Each one forced me to confront not just external obstacles, but my own limitations. I pushed, adjusted, rebuilt. The first successful simulation ran clean at 12:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. When the results appeared stable, efficient, undeniably real, I cried for the first time in months. Not because I felt triumphant, because I finally understood what I had built and what I had almost lost through my own impatience. That moment became the foundation for Aurora Secure Systems, born not from rage alone, but from rage refined by honesty, from a refusal to let their voices define my limits, combined with a willingness to admit where those limits actually were. Years later, when the Bloomberg alert lit up my phone and reporters chased the story, I remembered the girl in the Chicago dining room gripping a manila envelope like a lifeline. The board's dismissive nods, Dad's measured verdict, Caleb's complicated expression, part opportunism, part genuine belief that he was helping. They didn't break me, but they didn't make me either. I made myself through years of work that addressed every criticism they raised, and several they never thought to mention. The girl they tried to overwrite became the woman who could finally admit my original prototype needed work. Their method of telling me was cruel. Both things can be true. Chapter 3 of my life. The part they never saw coming had already begun the night I walked out of that house without a coat. But it didn't truly take shape until I stopped blaming them for everything and started building something that could withstand scrutiny I once couldn't face. That's the version of the story I rarely tell, the version where I'm not purely a victim, the version where growth required more than vindication. It's messier, less satisfying, harder to turn into a headline, but it's true. Denver didn't feel like a fresh start when I landed. It felt like exile. The airport lights were harsh, the air painfully dry, and the cold sliced through the thin jacket I'd grabbed while rushing out of Chicago. But something steadied inside me when I stepped onto the sidewalk outside the terminal. I wasn't running from them. I was running toward myself. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was messier. My apartment sat on the fringe of a neighborhood developers hadn't touched yet. Brick buildings with cracked windows, stairwells that echoed, hallways smelling faintly of old carpet and last night's cooking. The heater wheezed every time it kicked on, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up. The first night I sat on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet, eating cold cereal from the box, and cried until my throat hurt. Not graceful tears, not cinematic sorrow. Ugly, gasping sobs that left me curled against the wall, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The space was mine. For the first time in my life, no one else held a key. But ownership felt less like freedom and more like abandonment. I had chosen this. I had walked away from everything familiar. And now I was alone in a city that didn't know my name, didn't care about my dreams, and wouldn't notice if I disappeared. I didn't sleep that first week. Not really. I would lie on the mattress I'd bought from a secondhand store, staring at water stains on the ceiling, replaying the meeting in my head. Dad's measured dismissal, Caleb's matter-of-fact tone, the board members who never looked me in the eye. I rehearsed better responses, sharper comebacks, more confident defenses, knowing none of them would change what happened. Some nights, I wondered if they were right. I set up my routine with the precision of someone who needed structure to survive. My day job covered rent, tutoring paid for groceries, hardware repair handled emergencies. Nights belonged to Aurora, the name I scribbled onto a light blue sticky note and pressed above my desk like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. My workspace consisted of a wooden table salvaged from a thrift shop, its surface scratched and uneven. I spread notes across it anyway, taping diagrams to the wall, marking changes with red pens, rewriting code until the numbers finally aligned. The room felt raw brick wood, dim light dust on every surface. But raw wasn't liberating. Not at first. Raw was terrifying. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. Days when the weight of what I was attempting pressed so hard against my chest that breathing felt like labor. I would stare at the code on my screen, knowing exactly what needed to be fixed, and feel absolutely paralyzed. My hands wouldn't move. My brain wouldn't engage. I would just sit there watching the cursor blink, hating myself for being weak. I called in sick to my day job more times than I should have. Canceled tutoring sessions because I couldn't face another person. Ate crackers and peanut butter for dinner 3 nights in a row because going to the grocery store required energy I didn't have. Depression doesn't announce itself. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack in the foundation, until one day you realize you're standing in a flood you didn't see coming. I coded until my hands cramped, tested modules until my eyes burned, survived on cheap noodles and vending machine granola bars because I refused to let any distraction siphon energy away from the core work. Each breakthrough felt like oxygen. Each failure taught me something the Chicago boardroom never could. Resilience wasn't inherited. It was chosen, every single day. But some days I didn't choose it. Some days I chose nothing. I just existed, waiting for the hours to pass, hoping tomorrow would feel different. One evening, while reworking the dynamic compliance layer, I noticed the margins in my old research notebooks. They were filled with Dad's comments from over the years. Too ambitious. Flawed logic. Needs supervision. Not scalable. In Chicago, those notes had crushed me. In Denver, I wanted them to become fuel. They didn't. Not automatically. Not magically. Instead, I found myself reading them over and over, searching for evidence that he was wrong, and sometimes finding the opposite. Some of his criticisms were valid. Some of my logic was flawed. Some of my ambitions were untethered from reality. Admitting this didn't feel like growth. It felt like drowning. I rewrote every line he had dismissed, and with every revision, the old version of myself fought back. She wanted vindication, not improvement. She wanted to prove them wrong, not to become better. She was angry, and anger was easier than honesty. The first working prototype didn't come together in a triumphant rush. It came together slowly, painfully, after months of false starts and abandoned approaches. The night it finally ran clean, a winter storm had cut power to half the block. Sudden darkness shocked me into stillness. Silence filled the room except for the faint hum of a backup battery I'd installed weeks earlier. The device on the table glowed in my flashlight beam. I held my breath and ran the test again, slower this time, watching every segment respond exactly as designed. The mapping was held. The compression layer didn't choke. The engine processed without crashing. Everything worked. I didn't stand and cheer, didn't call anyone. I simply touched the prototype gently and let the truth settle. I had done this alone. No resources, no investors, no family name backing me, just grit and a blueprint they dismissed as impossible. And then I cried again, not from joy, from exhaustion. from relief, from the terrifying realization that success didn't erase the pain that preceded it. The months of doubt, the nights of despair, the moments when I genuinely considered giving up, they didn't disappear because the test passed. They stayed with me, embedded in the achievement, like cracks in a repaired vase. I called my mother the next morning. Not Dad, not Caleb, just Mom. She answered on the third ring, voice cautious, as if expecting bad news. "I built something," I said, "something real." Silence stretched across the line. Then, "That's wonderful, Grace." Her tone was warm, but distant, the way you congratulate a stranger's child. She didn't ask what I built, didn't ask how I was doing, didn't ask if I needed anything. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When I hung up, I felt more alone than before I called. Over time, Denver stopped feeling like exile. I learned which cafes stayed open late, which bus routes ran past midnight, which thrift shops had old hardware worth salvaging. A rhythm emerged, unsteady at first, then solid enough to build on. But I never stopped being scared. I just got better at functioning while terrified. A year passed, then another. Aurora evolved from scribbled diagrams into code repositories, from a scrappy idea into something measurable. I presented my work to a small incubator program, expecting rejection. My hands shook the entire time. My voice cracked twice. I forgot a key statistic and had to admit I didn't remember the number. Instead of dismissing me, the lead advisor leaned forward and asked, "Where did you learn to build like this?" His tone didn't accuse. It was respected. That moment mattered more than he knew, not because it validated my work, but because it validated that imperfection didn't disqualify me. I could shake, I could forget, I could be visibly nervous, and still be taken seriously. The incubator gave me a workspace barely more than a converted storage room, but it had stable power and a door that locked. I worked there until dawn most days, filling the whiteboard with simulations, marking performance dips, chasing margin improvements with an obsession I didn't apologize for. The program director introduced me to an early-stage investor named Dana. She wore thick glasses, spoke in precise sentences, and reviewed my entire architecture without saying a word for nearly an hour. When she finally looked up, she said, "You're solving a problem the government hasn't figured out how to articulate yet." Her investment came without conditions. She didn't ask for control. I didn't demand I step aside for someone with a louder resume. She trusted the work. "You're also clearly exhausted," she added. "When did you last take a day off?" I couldn't remember. "That's not sustainable," she said. "Burnout kills more startups than bad ideas. Take care of yourself, or you won't be around to see this succeed." No one had ever told me that before. My family measured worth by output. Rest was my weakness. Struggle was character building. Dana was the first person to suggest that survival mattered as much as achievement. I didn't know how to follow her advice, but I tried. I started taking walks, eating actual meals, sleeping more than 4 hours. The changes felt foreign, almost indulgent. But slowly the fog that had settled over my thinking began to lift. With her support, Aurora gained its first team members, 3 engineers hungry to build something unprecedented. They worked out of a room that used to store cleaning supplies. The ceiling leaked during heavy storms. Lights flickered when we plugged in too many servers. None of them cared. They believed in the architecture. They believed in the mission. They believed in me. Their belief terrified me more than any criticism ever had. What if I failed them? What if I wasn't the leader they thought I was? What if this whole thing collapsed and took their careers with it? I didn't share these fears. I performed with confidence I didn't feel. I made decisions while second-guessing myself. I led meetings while wondering if everyone could see how uncertain I was. Maybe that's what leadership actually is. Not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to move forward despite it. Caleb and Dad never asked about my life during those years. They assumed silence meant failure. In their world, success required announcements and validation. I didn't correct their assumptions. Distance gave me room to breathe, to grow, to evolve without commentary. I thought about them sometimes mostly in the quiet stretches between breakthroughs, not with longing, with something more complicated. Anger, yes, but also grief. Grief for the family I wished I had. Grief for the father who might have been proud if he could see past his own limitations. Grief for the brother who might have been an ally instead of a competitor. The memory of that boardroom stayed sharp, not because it fueled me, but because it marked the exact moment I realized I couldn't wait for them to change. I had to change first. I had to become someone who didn't need their approval to feel real. Aurora's first major test came when we pitched to a mid-size logistics firm with outdated systems desperately needing modernization. The CEO asked tough questions, the kind that forced me to explain in plain terms what I had designed. Halfway through my response, I lost my train of thought. Panic flashed through me. The silence stretched. "Take your time," he said. I breathed, found the thread, continued. He settled back in his chair and nodded. "Your team has built something genuinely exceptional, Ms. Miller." He signed the contract 2 weeks later. Not because I was perfect, because I was honest about what I didn't know and confident about what I did. The next round came faster. Investors I once would have begged for attention now asked if I had room for them in my cap table. Agencies began circling, curious about the tech, curious about the woman behind it. Through all of it, I stayed scared. The fear never left. It just became familiar, like background noise I learned to work around. Late one night while reviewing the compliance engine's predictive outputs, a thought moved through me, quiet but rooted. This is the life I was meant to build. Not the one dictated at Dad's table. Not the one shaped by Caleb's arrogance. Not the one squeezed between their expectations and their doubts. This one. Concrete floors, old brick, flickering lights, a team powered by belief, not bloodlines, a founder who still woke up anxious most mornings but got out of bed anyway. The city didn't shape me, it revealed me. All of me, the strength and the weakness, the determination and the despair, the confidence and the crippling self-doubt. By the time Aurora crossed the threshold from promising to unstoppable, I knew my family would eventually come knocking. Not because they cared, but because success has a way of rewriting who people believe you are. That day hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. And unlike the past, I would be ready, not because I had conquered my fears, but because I had learned to carry them. Dana handed me the ticket, the same way people hand over medication, firm, decisive, no opening for debate. "Show up," she said. "Visibility matters now." I didn't want visibility. I wanted quiet. The thought of standing in a room full of people who would judge me, evaluate me, measure me against standards I might not meet, it made my stomach clench. But I went anyway, stepping out of the car with the same steady breath I used before difficult meetings. I told myself this was just another industry event, nothing more. My hands were shaking when I walked through the door. I pressed them against my sides, hoping no one would notice. Inside, the space felt too bright. Overhead lights stretched across long rows of tables, reflecting off metal fixtures and glass panels in sharp, scattered angles. I walked through the crowd without lingering, choosing a seat tucked near a side entrance. I preferred edges. Edges meant exits. Edges meant escape routes if everything became too much. People streamed in with practiced confidence. Executives, fund managers, directors from organizations that built reputations on polite gatekeeping. Conversations drifted around me, market projections, endowments, mergers, trivial industry gossip. No one noticed I'd arrived, which suited me perfectly. But it also stung. A small, petty part of me wanted to be noticed. I wanted someone to recognize what I had built. I wanted validation I was ashamed to need. The program began with a sequence of speeches that blended together canned praise for innovation, recycled anecdotes about leadership, polite applause that rose and died in predictable waves. I listened without actually hearing, letting the noise flatten into background static. My team stood across the room talking with quiet purpose. That steadiness anchored me more than anything on stage. I texted May, "I hate this." She replied, "I know. 30 more minutes. You can do this." I wasn't sure I could. My chest felt tight. My throat felt dry. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to go back to the office, where things made sense, where I didn't have to perform for strangers who might not take me seriously. The shift started as a ripple barely perceptible at first. A rustle, a murmur, a few heads turning toward the suspended screens above the stage. Then something changed in the air, the way a room feels just before someone announces bad news. The screen flickered. The host stalled mid-sentence. A sudden low hush pressed across the ballroom like a descending weight. Then the red alert banner appeared. Breaking news. Federal Infrastructure Compliance Bureau confirms Aurora Secure Systems as pilot partner founder and CEO Grace Miller. My name wasn't simply displayed. It was stamped across the room, unavoidable bright, leaving no place to retreat. And in the stillness that followed, the entire ballroom recalibrated. Forks stopped midair. Conversations froze. It felt as though the oxygen had thinned. I couldn't breathe. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room started to blur. This is a panic attack, I thought. You're having a panic attack in front of everyone. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white, forced myself to take one breath, then another, and then across the distance, my father's face. He sat at a table positioned prominently near the center, surrounded by donors he entertained often. His expression broke before he could mask it. First shock, then something sharper, something he'd never allow himself to show if he had known he was being watched. He looked again at the screen, as if repetition could soften the words. It didn't. Caleb's reaction registered next, his jaw locked, his eyes narrowed. Whatever irritation he'd carried for years hardened into something unsteady and unsettled. I should have felt triumphant. This was the moment I had imagined for years, the moment they finally saw what I had built, the moment their dismissal was proven wrong in front of everyone who mattered to them. Instead, I felt sick. The host attempted to proceed, stumbling over his script, but the audience wasn't listening. The attention in the room had shifted sharply. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't applause. It was scrutiny, the kind that feels like a spotlight even when no beam is pointed at you. Someone approached me first, not with fanfare, with calculation. "Congratulations," a man said, quietly offering a hand. "This changes the landscape." I accepted the handshake. My palm was sweating. I hoped he didn't notice. Another handshake followed, then another. Polite, crisp, efficient acknowledgments from people who had never bothered to meet my eyes before tonight. Their tone wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, it was strategic. They were adjusting their seating, their alliances, their assumptions, all in real time. I excused myself from the cluster and walked toward the far wall, desperately needing space to breathe. The air in the corner felt cooler, steadier. I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes. "You did it," I told myself. "You actually did it." But the voice in my head didn't sound triumphant. It sounded exhausted. It sounded scared. It sounded like a woman who had spent so long fighting that she didn't know how to stop. The quiet didn't last long. Footsteps approached behind me. "Grace." My father's voice carried none of the authority he usually wore so easily. He stopped just a few feet away, keeping a careful distance. His expression looked older than I remembered, strained around the edges, the kind of strain that forms when definitions break. "You should have told us," he said, not angry, not soft, just unsettled. I opened my mouth to deliver the sharp response I had rehearsed 1,000 times, the cutting remark, the vindication, the proof that I was better than everything he believed about me. What came out was different. "I wanted to," I said. "For years I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to be proud of me. I wanted you to see what I was building and say it mattered." My voice cracked. I hated that it cracked. "But every time I tried, you changed the subject. Or you compared me to Caleb. Or you looked at me like I was wasting my potential on something you didn't understand." I swallowed hard. "So I stopped trying. And I built it anyway." Dad's face shifted. Not understanding, not yet, but something close to uncertainty. The ground he stood on was less stable than he thought. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You didn't ask." Caleb joined him, tension rolling off him in uneven waves. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look? You blindsided everyone." I turned to face him. For years I had imagined this confrontation. In my fantasies, I was always composed, always controlled, always delivering perfect lines that left him speechless. In reality, I was trembling. "I didn't blindside you," I said. "I just stopped waiting for permission to exist." My stepmother hovered behind them, watching the surrounding crowd as if calculating which expressions were directed at us. Her concern wasn't for me, it was for the social consequences unraveling around them. My father extended a hand slightly, not to touch me, just a reflex born from years of expecting my cooperation without question. I flinched. He noticed. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or recognition that the daughter he remembered was not the woman standing in front of him. "What do you want from us?" he asked quietly. The question stopped me. I had expected demands, arguments, attempts to control the narrative. I hadn't expected him to ask what I wanted. "I don't know," I admitted. The honesty surprised me as much as it surprised him. I thought I would know by now. I thought this moment would feel different. Different how? Better. I looked at the floor, then back at him. I thought proving you wrong would feel like winning, but it doesn't. It just feels like the end of a very long fight. A wave of applause rose from the stage as the host attempted to regain order, but the room was still watching us, subtle glances sideways, curiosity, not malicious, just witnessing a shift they didn't yet understand. My father finally exhaled, a slow, weighted breath. "This isn't how our family handles things," he said. "It's how I handle things," I replied. Caleb shook his head once tightly. "You're changing the rules." "No," I answered. "I'm just playing by different ones." I turned away before they could reply. Their silence followed me across the room, heavy, unsteady, realizing perhaps for the first time that I was no longer part of the familiar shape they relied on. I made it to the bathroom before the tears came, locked myself in a stall, sat on the closed toilet lid, and let everything I had been holding back finally break loose. I cried for the 23-year-old who walked out of that boardroom believing she had lost everything. I cried for the years in Denver eating crackers for dinner, wondering if she would ever be enough. I cried for the version of myself who still wanted her father to be proud, even after everything. And I cried because the victory she had worked so hard for didn't feel like victory at all. It felt like grief. Grief for the family she might have had. Grief for the relationships that might have been. Grief for the simple, impossible wish that things could have been different. When I finally walked out of the bathroom, my eyes were red. My makeup was ruined. I didn't care. May found me in the hallway. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. "You okay?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I will be." By the time I reached the exit, I understood exactly what had shifted. They hadn't lost a daughter. They'd lost the version of me they could control, and I had lost something too, the fantasy that success would heal everything, the belief that proving them wrong would make me whole. I walked into the night air cold and sharp against my tear-stained face. The real work, the work of figuring out who I was without them, was only beginning. The morning after the gala, I reached the office before anyone else. Dawn barely touched the windows, leaving the workspace in a muted gray glow that made everything look suspended, waiting for direction. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and waited for the familiar calm to settle over me. It didn't come. Instead, I stood in the empty hallway, heart pounding, wondering if everything I had built was about to collapse. The hum of our servers greeted me first, followed by the soft tick of the wall clock. This place had become more than a workplace. It was the only environment that had ever reflected my effort without distortion. But today, even that reflection felt fragile. I placed my bag on the desk and powered my laptop. The dashboard lit up instantly. Traffic upticks load, distribution compliance queries, system health. Everything is stable. Everything functioning exactly as intended, even under the weight of national attention. But the numbers didn't calm me. They terrified me, because now for the first time, failure would be public. Before the announcement, Aurora could stumble in private. We could fix bugs without headlines. We could recover from mistakes without investors watching. Now every flaw would be magnified. Every weakness would be analyzed. Every decision I made would be scrutinized by people who wanted me to fail. My phone buzzed. A message from the engineering channel auto-scaling triggered twice. No errors. All nodes are green. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt the weight of expectations pressing against my chest. A second notification arrived, then a third. Within minutes, my inbox was flooded: interview requests, partnership inquiries, government liaison emails, investor messages. The volume was overwhelming. I scrolled through subjects without reading them, paralyzed by the sheer scale of what was happening. May appeared in my doorway with a mug of tea and a quiet smile. "The system's holding beautifully. You built something solid." "We built it," I corrected automatically. But my voice sounded hollow. She studied my face for a moment. "You okay?" "Fine," I lied. She nodded, unconvinced, and left me to work. I wasn't fine. I was drowning in slow motion, and I didn't know how to ask for help. The first crack appeared 3 days later. We had scheduled a critical demonstration for a defense contractor, a company whose approval would validate Aurora's security protocols for an entire tier of government partnerships. I had prepared for weeks, rehearsed every scenario. I anticipated every question. What I hadn't anticipated was my own arrogance. The demonstration began smoothly. Our CTO walked through the architecture while I handled the strategic overview. The contractors team nodded along, asking technical questions. I answered with confidence that felt earned. By the halfway point, I was certain we had won. Then their lead engineer asked about our failover protocol. What happens if your primary encryption node goes offline during a zero-day attack? I knew the answer. I had designed the answer. But instead of explaining our redundancy system, I decided to show them live in real time with no safety net. "Let me demonstrate," I said, already reaching for the console. May's eyes widened. She shook her head slightly, a warning I chose to ignore. I initiated a simulated node failure, expecting the backup system to engage seamlessly. For 3 seconds, everything worked exactly as designed. Then the backup node crashed. The screen froze. Error messages cascaded across the display. The room went silent except for the soft hum of cooling fans and the rapid clicking of our CTO's keyboard as he scrambled to diagnose the problem. I stood there watching everything unravel, unable to move. "This is unexpected," I heard myself say. The words sounded distant, like someone else was speaking them. The contractor's lead engineer leaned back in his chair. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. I was disappointed. The kind of disappointment that comes from watching someone you almost respected reveal they weren't ready. "Perhaps we should reschedule," he said carefully. "We can fix this," I said. "Give us 10 minutes. "Ms. Miller," and his voice was gentle but final. "We've seen enough." They left without signing anything, without promising to return, without offering the polite reassurances that usually soften rejection. After they were gone, May found me in my office, staring at the wall. "The backup node had a memory leak," she said quietly. "We found it. It's fixed. Too late. We can reach out, explain what happened, offer another demo. They won't come back." I knew it with certainty. In this industry, you rarely get second chances to make first impressions. I pushed too hard. I wanted to impress them instead of just showing them what works. May sat down across from me. "You made a mistake. It happens." "Not to me." The words came out sharper than I intended. "Not anymore. I can't afford mistakes. Not now. Not with everything at stake." She was quiet for a long moment. "Grace, if you think you can build something this complex without ever failing, you're setting yourself up for a breakdown." "I already failed once," I said. "In Chicago. I failed so completely that my own family stole my work because they didn't believe I could execute it. I swore I would never give anyone that ammunition again. And now you're so afraid of failure that you're taking risks you shouldn't take." She leaned forward. "That demo didn't need a live failover test. You know that. But you wanted to prove something to them, to yourself, I don't know. And it backfired." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because she was right, and admitting it felt like admitting that everything I had built was standing on a foundation of overcompensation and fear. The next 2 weeks were brutal. Word spread about the failed demo. Not publicly, our industry is small enough that gossip travels through private channels, but enough that I noticed hesitation in conversations that used to flow easily. Investors who had been eager to connect suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Government liaisons who had praised our architecture now asked pointed questions about reliability. I responded by working harder, sleeping less, checking the system logs obsessively, as if constant vigilance could prevent another failure. It couldn't. The second crack appeared during a routine security audit, one we had passed twice before. This time, the auditor flagged a vulnerability in our authentication layer. Not critical, not urgent, but present. A flaw I had missed because I was so focused on the encryption engine that I neglected the surrounding infrastructure. "This should have been caught months ago," the auditor said, not unkindly. "Your core technology is impressive, but the supporting systems need attention." I thanked him for his thoroughness, promised to address the issue immediately, smiled professionally until he left the building. Then I locked myself in my office and didn't come out for 6 hours. May found me again that evening sitting in the dark. "The authentication fix is deployed," she said. "Jared ran the tests. Everything passes." "Good." She didn't leave. Instead, she sat down on the floor across from my desk, her back against the wall. "When was the last time you ate?" she asked. I couldn't remember. "When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours?" I couldn't remember that either. "Grace," her voice was soft but firm, "you're falling apart." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're running on fumes and fear, and it's affecting your judgment. The live demo was a mistake born from overconfidence. The authentication gap was a mistake born from tunnel vision. Both of them happened because you're trying to do everything yourself, and you're too exhausted to see clearly." "What am I supposed to do?" The question came out ragged. "Stop, slow down." The world doesn't slow down. The contracts don't wait. The competitors don't rest. If I stop, everything stops. "That's not true," she said. "You built a team. You hired people who are capable and committed. But you won't let them carry any of the weight because you're convinced that if you're not controlling everything, it will all fall apart." "It might." "It might," she agreed. "But it definitely will if you burn out. You're not superhuman, Grace. You're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to admit that this is hard." I stared at the ceiling. The silence stretched between us. "I don't know how," I finally said. "I don't know how to trust anyone else with this. My whole life, every time I trusted someone, they let me down. My family, my mentors, everyone." "I know," May said. "But we're not them, and you have to decide whether you're going to keep punishing us for what they did or whether you're going to let us actually help you." She stood up and walked to the door. "Go home, sleep, eat something that isn't from a vending machine. The system will still be here tomorrow." I wanted to argue. I wanted to insist that I was needed, that my presence was essential, that stepping away was impossible. Instead, I nodded. "Okay," I said. It was the hardest word I had ever spoken. I drove to Chicago with no plan except finishing what they had started 2 years earlier. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was murkier. I was running away from the failures in Denver by confronting the failures in Chicago. The highway stretched ahead in a long, unbroken line, the kind of road that forces clarity whether you want it or not. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my thoughts moved in fast, clipped lines sharp enough to cut through every old memory that tried to surface. Except they didn't cut through. They circled. The failed demo. The authentication gap. May's words about burnout. The look on the contractor's face when the backup node crashed. By the time I reached the city limits, the sky had shifted to a dull slate blue, the color of storms that don't need thunder to make their point. I parked at the curb outside my parents' house and turned off the engine. I sat there for 20 minutes, unable to move. What was I doing here? What did I think would happen? That confronting them would somehow fix the mess I had made of the last 2 weeks, that their acknowledgement would validate me in ways the failed demo had undermined. I was looking for something they couldn't give me. I knew that. But I went inside anyway. Their house appeared exactly as it always had. Trimmed hedges, glowing porch light, perfectly swept steps. Nothing changed. Nothing learned. Nothing earned. Inside, their voices carried from the dining room, low-clipped, already rehearsed. I stepped through the door without pausing, without softening my steps, without rehearsing my tone. That was the girl I used to be, measured, cautious, always shrinking to fit their expectations. Tonight I was too tired to shrink. Dad lifted his head. First impatience etched across his face as if I were late to a meeting he didn't respect enough to attend. Mom shifted immediately into performance mode, smoothing her blouse, rearranging her expression into something she assumed looked maternal. Caleb crossed his arms with practiced ease, radiating confidence like nothing in his world had been disrupted. "Finally," Dad said, gesturing toward an empty seat. "We've been waiting." I stayed standing. "Say whatever you plan to say." Mom blinked hard. "Sweetheart, sit. There's no need for this tone." "This tone," I replied, "is what happens when someone stops apologizing for existing." The words came out sharp, but underneath them I felt hollow. I wasn't delivering them from strength, I was delivering them from exhaustion, from weeks of failure I couldn't admit to anyone. Dad stiffened. Caleb smirked. The choreography of my childhood assembled itself around the table, but this time I wasn't sure I had the energy to disrupt it. Dad cleared his throat, shifting into the firm, authoritative cadence he reserved for moments when he wanted to reestablish control. "This valuation news, it's dangerous. Too fast, too public. You're exposed, Grace. You need guidance before you make mistakes you can't walk back." Guidance. The same word he used when he rejected my proposal 2 years earlier. But this time, instead of rage, I felt something else. Something closer to recognition. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had made mistakes. The live demo, the authentication gap, the exhaustion that was clouding my judgment, the arrogance that made me believe I could handle everything alone. "You might be right," I heard myself say. The room went still. Dad's eyebrows rose. Caleb's smirk faltered. Mom looked like she had swallowed something unexpected. "What did you say?" Dad asked slowly. "I said you might be right." I pulled out a chair and sat down, suddenly too tired to stand. "I've made mistakes. Recent ones, significant ones. I'm not handling the pressure as well as I should be." No one spoke. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. "I didn't come here for guidance," I continued. "I don't trust you to give it. But I can admit that I'm struggling, that I don't have all the answers. Building something this complex is harder than I expected, and I'm not doing it perfectly." Caleb leaned forward. "So you're saying you need help?" "I'm saying I'm human. There's a difference." Dad's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. He wasn't used to this version of me, the version that could admit weakness without collapsing into it. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. The question stopped me. I didn't have a clear answer. "Because I'm tired of pretending," I finally said. "I'm tired of performing with strength I don't always feel. I'm tired of treating every conversation with you like a battle I have to win. I'm tired of hating you for things that happened years ago while refusing to admit that I'm not perfect either." Mom's eyes glistened. "Grace?" "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said quickly. "I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm just telling you the truth. Maybe for the first time. I don't know what I want from you. I don't know if there's anything you can give me, but I know that carrying this anger is exhausting, and I don't want to do it anymore." The silence returned, but it felt different now, less hostile, more uncertain. Caleb spoke first. "I didn't realize you were struggling." "You didn't ask." "Would you have told me if I did?" I considered the question. "Probably not. But maybe that's something I need to change too." Dad rubbed his temples. "This is a lot to process." "I know. I don't know how to respond." "I know that too." We sat there, the four of us, in a silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't combative either. Something had shifted, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the people we had been weren't the only people we could be. "I should go," I said eventually. "Stay for dinner," Mom offered. Her voice was tentative, uncertain. "Not tonight." I stood. "But maybe another time." Dad nodded slowly. We'd like that. I wasn't sure if I believed him. I wasn't sure if I believed myself, but the words felt like a small step towards something neither of us could name yet. I walked to the door, then paused. I'm not who you think I am, I said, not turning around, but I'm also not who I've been pretending to be. I'm somewhere in between, and I'm trying to figure out where that leaves us. I didn't wait for a response. Outside, the cold night air hit my face, sharp and grounding. I walked to my car, slowly letting the silence settle around me. For years, I had imagined this confrontation as a victory, a moment where I would prove them wrong and walk away triumphant. Instead, I walked away tired, uncertain, humans. And somehow that felt more honest than any victory could have been. The drive back to Denver was quiet. No triumphant music, no sense of closure. Just the hum of the engine and the slow realization that the hardest battles aren't fought with other people. They're fought with the versions of ourselves we've outgrown. I didn't know what would happen with my family. I didn't know if the damage could be repaired or if we would always be strangers who shared DNA but nothing else. But I knew one thing: I was done pretending to be invincible. The woman who landed in Denver 4 years ago believed she had to be perfect to survive. The woman driving back tonight understood that perfection was just another kind of prison. Real strength wasn't about never failing. It was about failing, admitting it, and choosing to keep going anyway. When I finally reached my apartment, I didn't check the system logs. I didn't respond to emails. I didn't plan tomorrow's meetings. I took a shower, ate a real meal, went to bed at a reasonable hour. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of everything that could go wrong. I blended back into the gala crowd before anyone could steer me toward the table I'd walked away from. The music carried a lighter rhythm, yet underneath it ran a subtle thrum, an awareness that the headline looping across the screens had rearranged the evening's social landscape. I stopped near the dessert display, watching guests who were suddenly recalibrating how close they should stand to me. It was an odd thing witnessing strangers shift their footing around my presence, unsure whether to speak or simply observe. I hadn't gone looking for attention, but it found me the moment the screens lit up with my name. A man in a gray suit approached, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. His tone was warm but respectful. Ms. Miller. My wife and I saw the announcement. Congratulations. Truly remarkable. I thanked him with a small nod. He didn't linger, didn't press for anything, just smiled and stepped back. That brief, measured courtesy felt more genuine than the whispers circling around us. Before I could finish a breath, Caleb appeared at my side. His expression was tight, his movements clipped, as if he'd walked through a wall to get to me. He positioned himself squarely between me and a nearby group still trying to pretend they weren't watching. "You're making this harder," he said under his breath. "Why walk around like this? Dad's furious. You're embarrassing him." "I'm taking space," I answered. "That's all." "This isn't the time to make statements," he muttered. "This isn't a press tour for whatever you're running. It's a company," I corrected. "And it's not whatever." The correction hit him harder than it should have. He shifted his stance, recalibrating. "Grace, that valuation puts you at risk. Federal contracts attract political attention, legal oversight, and aggressive auditing. You can't just, I've handled it. You don't even know what's coming," he snapped quietly. "You can't navigate that alone. You need someone who understands compliance, someone with my background." A soft laugh escaped me, not out of amusement but disbelief at how familiar this script felt. "Tell me something, Caleb. What exactly would you be managing risk?" he fired back. "Regulations change constantly. You can't predict that. My platform does. That's why it was approved." His eyes flicked to my face, carrying irritation he couldn't hide. "You're throwing around buzzwords." "No," I said evenly. "I'm naming features you dismissed as a hobby." He stepped closer. "You can't run a large operation based on instinct. You need advisors, people who've worked inside established institutions." "You mean people Dad trusts," I said. "Don't do that," he muttered. "Don't twist it. I'm not twisting anything. I'm describing the part you leave out." He held my gaze, then looked away, jaw shifting. "You know Dad wants what's best. Dad wants control," I said softly. "And you want to stay relevant." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He wasn't angry, just shaken. For the first time he realized the story he'd built for himself didn't match the one unfolding around him. "You're treating me like the problem," he whispered. "You're not the problem," I said. "You're the barrier I moved through." The truth landed between us with a weight neither of us spoke into. He stayed frozen, his sense of hierarchy slipping faster than he could catch it. I walked away first. He didn't follow. The far end of the ballroom was quieter, lit softly with amber lamps and surrounded by antique maps displayed in glass cases. A waiter passed with a tray I didn't touch. Donors whispered as I walked by, but their tones held curiosity rather than doubt. One woman lifted her hand in a small, wordless gesture of recognition. I returned a nod. As I paused near one of the display tables, a familiar pair approached the Wilkersons. They carried themselves with the quiet assurance of people who didn't need to announce their status. "We wanted to congratulate you," Mr. Wilkerson said. "Your work is extraordinary." His wife added, "Most people lead with ego. You lead with substance. It's refreshing." Their words were so simple and grounded that I felt them land. I thanked them sincerely. It wasn't flattery, it was acknowledgement without an agenda. When they moved on, a ripple passed through the crowd. People stepped aside instinctively as the chairman of the Hale Foundation approached. The same man my father spent years trying to impress. The same man who never once looked in my direction at any previous event. He came directly to me. "Ms. Miller," he said, extending his hand, "your work has been the subject of several board discussions. I'd appreciate speaking with you later tonight if your schedule permits." Not Dad's schedule, not the family's agenda. Mine. I agreed, and he nodded once before walking away. No theatrics, no performance, just respect. The shift in the room sharpened. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like someone had tilted the entire environment by a few degrees. Across the ballroom, my father finally registered what was unfolding. His face tightened as the chairman passed him, without a glance. Not even a polite nod. That tiny omission did more damage to his worldview than any confrontation could have. It stripped away the illusion he'd curated for decades that he held influence simply because he believed he should. For the first time, he was standing in a room that didn't orbit around him. I didn't move toward him. I didn't soften. I didn't offer reassurance. I simply stood in the version of myself he had refused to acknowledge. The orchestra shifted to its final set, and I realized something I hadn't felt earlier in the night. I wasn't trying to belong here anymore. I wasn't shrinking or strategizing how to blend in. The ballroom didn't feel foreign. I wasn't the person who used to apologize for taking up space, and everyone watching, Dad included, could see it plainly. Chapter 1. The Dinner They Will Not Forget. I always thought humiliation had an audible component. That night, it was the delicate, sharp sound of silverware striking the ceramic dinner plate, followed by the soft, muffled laugh that was not intended for my ears, but reached them anyway. This was the specific kind of laugh people produce when they genuinely believe you are too ineffectual or docile to offer any meaningful resistance. I had barely settled into my designated spot at the extensive walnut dining table when my brother Caleb crossed his arms and settled deeper into his chair, wearing the predictable, condescending grin he always deployed right before delivering a calculated verbal attack. The atmosphere instantly solidified into a painful quiet, save for the gentle flicker of the expensive tapered candles. "Still living off Dad's money?" he demanded, raising his voice just enough to ensure every person seated could overhear the question. The younger cousin, situated further down the long table, snickered predictably. Linda, my stepmother, smoothly adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, a gesture of impeccable bored refinement. My father deliberately did not lift his gaze from his half-eaten dinner. He continued slicing into his perfectly cooked steak, then stated matter-of-factly, "Next month you should find your own place, Grace." I dismissed the bait, reminding them that 3 solid years of rent payments had been entirely my own responsibility was pointless. No one required an accounting of the late nights I had worked. I certainly wouldn't mention the tech company I had successfully built. Reciting the list of contracts I had already signed was useless. The truth was, none of them had ever inquired. I reached out, picked up my unused napkin, and placed it neatly beside my plate before I stood up. Across the room, chairs made a grating, high-pitched noise as they scraped against the polished hardwood floor. Somebody whispered the word drama low enough to be clearly insulting, but high enough to maintain plausible deniability. Rachel. My cousin rolled her eyes conspicuously at her husband seated next to her. Grace, please sit down. My father commanded, his tone flat. A soft refusal was all I offered. I think I'll pass on dessert tonight. The heavy oak door clicked shut with a decisive finality behind me. Outside, the severe February cold immediately struck my face, drawing the heat away from my skin. Chicago, in the middle of winter, is unforgiving. I regretted not bringing a much heavier coat because I had not made any plans to exit the house this early. My car was unfortunately parked at the extreme end of the very long driveway. I began walking rapidly, plumes of breath coming out in small, dense white clouds before disappearing into the night air. The subsequent 20-minute drive home passed without incident. Foregoing the radio, I preferred the oppressive silence. The lack of noise should have offered me some kind of mental reprieve, yet it failed completely. Their words continuously repeated themselves inside my head. Caleb's self-satisfied grin was a loop. The dismissal in my father's voice resonated with the clink of silverware. Linda's careful presentation of neutrality, her habit of always directing her attention just past me whenever I attempted to speak, was infuriatingly clear. Entering my apartment, I found it shrouded in darkness. The key ring dropped onto the kitchen counter with a loud sound. I stopped and leaned heavily against the granite kitchen island, still wearing my evening coat. A faint metallic click came from the radiator as the building heat cycled on. Through the closed window glass, the distant muffled traffic noise filtered in. This was the pattern for 28 years. I was the daughter who chose not to pursue the established lucrative path of medicine like Caleb had, the one who failed to secure a socially advantageous marriage. I was the daughter who worked on computer stuff, a mysterious activity that nobody in the family unit understood, nor did they ever bother to care about understanding. Just then, my phone buzzed briefly. It buzzed again. Immediately, a third time. Within moments, the vibrations became entirely continuous, so frequent and energetic, that the device started to visibly slide across the smooth countertop by itself. I grabbed it fully, expecting my father's number to dominate the screen. Instead, the display showed a bizarre torrent of missed calls from completely unknown sources. New York area codes blinked rapidly. Boston, San Francisco, and a multitude of local Chicago numbers flashed. The sheer volume of notifications stacked so fast, the phone's operating system visibly froze for approximately 3 long seconds. When the display finally unstuck itself, I scrolled down to see the emails. Dozens of new messages were flooding the inbox. These were requests for formal statements. Interview requests were stacking up. Every single message requested an immediate public comment. A major news alert was fixed prominently at the very top of my lock screen, glowing a vivid, urgent red. Breaking news. Aurora Secure Systems achieves federal-level pilot status, founder Grace Miller. I forced myself to read the entire headline twice, slowly absorbing the words. It was my actual full name. My own company's name was next to it. That was the massive federal contract I had been diligently working toward for 18 months. The one that necessitated full security clearances, extensive background checks, and an endless stream of meticulous documentation. It was official the proposal had successfully gone through the final approval stage. Someone, likely a government official or a contractor contact, had leaked the news prematurely to the press before I had even received the standard official call. The phone resumed its insistent physical buzzing. More strange, unknown numbers appeared. Then the familiar ones. My father's name, Caleb's, Linda's. Dad again, already a second time in minutes. A text message appeared from Caleb written entirely in capital letters. What did you do? Call now. A text from my father followed. We need to talk, immediately. I placed the phone face up gently onto the soft fabric of the couch and watched the screen light up repeatedly. Call after call continued to arrive. The bright display never once went dark. Aurora Secure Systems. I had launched the business 4 years prior with only $12,000 of carefully saved cash and a single refurbished laptop computer. Initially, the focus was basic cybersecurity consulting for mid-size regional companies. That work expanded into larger, more lucrative contracts, which eventually led to government subcontracts. No one in my immediate family knew any of the operational details of the business. Whenever they inquired about my profession, I simply stated tech consulting. Over time, they simply stopped asking. The scope of the federal pilot program completely changed the entire nature of the company. It dictated that Aurora's proprietary encryption protocols would be rigorously tested across a minimum of 3 critical government agencies. If the pilot successfully achieved all benchmarks, the resulting full contract was projected to be worth $47 million over a period of 5 years. This milestone was the culmination of 18 months spent in high-level meetings, comprehensive financial audits, and intensive security reviews. This information was now public knowledge. My father's number flashed brightly again. The call went unanswered. Instead, I accessed my email inbox. 63 new messages had arrived in the few minutes since I left the table. They were journalists from major financial and tech outlets, Bloomberg, Reuters, and TechCrunch. I noted messages from 2 prominent investment firms inquiring about the firm's plans for future funding rounds. One congratulatory note was from the Department of Homeland Security contact who had personally guided the final contract approval process. The persistent phone rang once more. This time the screen showed Linda's name. I let that call proceed directly to voicemail. For 4 years, this family never demonstrated any curiosity about my actual work. The moment I had mentioned starting the company, my father responded with, "That's ambitious," using the exact inflection he reserved for what he considered thoroughly bad ideas. Caleb's only input was to ask if I required financial assistance. Then he laughed dismissively when I confirmed I did not. Linda had instantly steered the conversation toward discussing Rachel's wedding plans. Now their combined urgency was evident. All of them repeatedly sought contact. I finally picked up the device and scrolled through the extensive list of missed calls. 14 calls originated from Dad. 9 came from Caleb. Linda had contributed 6, and 3 had surprisingly come from Rachel, who had not initiated direct conversation with me in 2 years. A new text appeared from Caleb Grace. "This is serious. Call me back. Seriously." That single word was his only acknowledgement, as if my professional life only achieved the status of serious when the news media decided to acknowledge it. I powered down the ringer completely. Placing the phone face down on the coffee table, I allowed the lights to fade. The apartment settled back into its previous quiet state. I could hear the subtle deep vibration of the building's main heating system running. A faint, distant sound of a television show leaked from the neighboring unit. These were normal, everyday sounds. I heard the identical sounds every single night upon returning from the office. But the objective facts surrounding the situation had radically shifted. 4 years ago, I began building Aurora in complete silence. No assistance was solicited from my family structure. There were 0 investors drawn from my father's influential social network. I received no professional introductions utilizing Caleb's medical school connections. I accomplished the work entirely alone, dedicating nights and weekends to the effort learning contract law fundamentals from online tutorial videos and mastering complex cybersecurity protocols through rigorous online courses. I had certainly made mistakes. The company nearly ran out of capital twice. I kept moving forward regardless of the obstacles. The fact remains they had failed to notice any of it. They simply lacked the inclination to notice. Presently, they were desperate to converse. I stood and slowly walked toward the window pane. The sprawling city of Chicago spread out far below my vantage point, thousands of artificial lights scattered across the deep, encroaching darkness. Somewhere out there in that light, reporters were actively writing stories about my fledgling company. Financial investors were making strategic calls, government officials were preparing their official public statements, and specifically in my father's expensive dining room, the family I had just left behind was undoubtedly struggling to process the news that the daughter they had so effortlessly dismissed had quietly built something substantial and real. My phone screen flared with light one final time. It was Dad. I watched his name glow fiercely for a few seconds before the light finally subsided. The logistics of tomorrow would be complex, calling back all media contacts. I needed to issue formal statements and immediately schedule mandatory high-stakes meetings. Handling the sudden intense public attention required an immediate comprehensive plan. Tonight, I remained standing at the window. The cold from the glass was a slight comfort. I permitted the silence to finally settle into the room. They had been afforded years to inquire about the nature of my work. They never took the opportunity. The world was now asking. I stood ready to provide the answer. I left the house before dawn, the sky still an indigo wash stretching across the horizon. The street lay empty except for a few porch lights flickering against the cold. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me that required a second glance. My focus shifted entirely to the day ahead, the real day, the one built on deadlines, infrastructure reports, and operational decisions that didn't pause for family drama. The ride back to the city felt quiet in a way that wasn't lonely. It was the quiet of a life no longer interrupted by old expectations or unsolicited commentary. As the buildings sharpened into view, I opened my laptop and connected to the system dashboard. The console populated instantly latency readings, load distribution compliance alerts, all lined in neat, precise rows. The world they questioned ran smoothly, with or without their doubts. Server load 63%. Auto-scaling active. Threat mapping stable. Traffic spike from the Bloomberg alert rising, controlled, predictable. My CTO sent a message as I rode through the last stretch of the freeway. The spike is steady. Adjustments initiated. No anomalies. His tone remained concise, almost surgical. It was the language of people who trusted the work because they had seen it function under pressure, not because they needed the illusion of leadership to soothe their insecurities. A second notification arrived immediately after. Largest enterprise client requesting to accelerate Phase 3. Feasible window 72 hours. I drafted a reply with a single line, "Proceed." Preparation begins today, and I closed the thread. Inside the office, early sunlight spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long silver stripes across polished concrete. A few staff members nodded as I passed, nothing dramatic, only acknowledgement that the day had begun. I didn't need applause. I needed clarity. By 7 in the morning, my leadership team gathered in the conference room, papers, open screens glowing with data. My CTO began with updates. Infrastructure absorbed last night's peak without hitting thresholds. The new caching layer performed better than predicted. We are seeing a latency improvement of 1.7 milliseconds across the core network, which is critical for the defense logistics contract. Good, I said. Prioritize enterprise accounts. Funnel non-essential signups into next week's queue. Confirm the new encryption key exchange protocol is fully integrated across all team deployment stations by close of business. The policy director spoke next, flipping through a binder filled with briefs. Commerce wants a scheduled briefing to discuss the legal implications of predictive compliance technology. The Treasury needs clarification on the cross-border compliance chain for our European clients. Defense Logistics is requesting an audit date for the second week of next month. Schedule the audit first, I replied. Their team moves fastest with early directives. Give Treasury the full compliance document, but defer the commerce briefing until after the audit. I want to go into that discussion with a clean sheet. She made notes rapidly, posture alert. No hesitation, no second guessing. She didn't question whether I understood the stakes. She knew I built the system that carried them. At 9 sharp, the COO of a logistics corporation joined via video call. His image flickered briefly before stabilizing. We're ready to finalize the 7-year contract for all our North American and Pacific hubs, he said. We need one final confirmation that your compatibility layer won't disrupt our legacy operations during the transition phase. It won't, I answered. The layer runs passively for the first 5 days, mapping traffic flow without engaging the engine. Full deployment completes in 6 weeks, not affecting your operational throughput by even 1% during the switch. That timeline works, he said, visibly relieved. We'll send the final papers by 12:30 today. Documents exchanged, revisions reviewed, signature executed. No celebration, just logistics. A congressional advisor called Next Voice clipped and efficient. We need throughput limits for your failure response protocol, specifically how quickly it can revert to a known stable state without data loss in a 0-day scenario. Documented and verified, I said. The system maintains a rollback capability of 0.03 seconds. I'll send the latest model by noon. You can stress test the simulator directly." He hung up without further comment. That was normal. Precision didn't need courtesy. Throughout the morning, I moved between decisions with quiet efficiency, approving an encryption budget increase, adjusting a project timeline, reviewing the updated infrastructure diagram. Every task reminded me of the years I had lived in that shadowed space where no one asked what I was capable of because they were already convinced I couldn't be capable of much. That world was gone. Around midday, the assistant knocked on my office door. "Your advisory panel is ready. We have the former Undersecretary of Defense, the lead compliance partner from a major law firm, and the CEO of a successful publicly traded cybersecurity company." 4 specialists entered, figures with real experience, not family friends appointed to keep appearances. They spread documents across the table discussing expansion feasibility, regulatory strain, and risk exposure. They didn't patronize, correct, or condescend. They asked direct questions because they expected direct answers. And I gave them everything they needed: system metrics, architectural logic, operational buffers, margins for error, redundancies for outages. No bluffing, no stalling. Data spoke for itself. When the meeting ended, the lead architect closed his folder. "Your timeline is aggressive," he said, "but possible. The architectural integrity is superior to anything we've evaluated in the past 5 years. That's all we need," I replied. The room emptied, leaving me with the hum of the HVAC system and the shifting glow of early afternoon light. Nothing dramatic, just the steady rhythm of work unbroken by unnecessary noise. Around 3, I stepped into the hallway for a brief moment of quiet. Staff moved around me, but no one hovered. They respected boundaries, because I had built a workspace that didn't rely on intimidation to function. The notification came as I stood near the window, Commerce Procurement Agreement, ready for final approval. I returned to my desk, read every line, corrected one technical detail, and signed. Moments later, the confirmation timestamp appeared. Permanent. Irreversible. Nothing in that moment required validation from my father. Nothing demanded interpretation from Caleb. The weight of the signature belonged entirely to me. By 6, I shut down my laptop. The office had begun to empty, conversations fading as staff gathered their bags and jackets. I walked through the lobby and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The street buzzed with the low roar of traffic, people crossing lights, shifting, nothing symbolic, nothing dramatic. Just the end of a long day, lived on my terms. My phone buzzed again, a message from my CTO. "Deployment ready. Waiting for your go." I typed one line, "Begin deployment." Then I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and walked down the sidewalk. Tonight didn't mark a turning point. It wasn't a milestone or a closure or a triumphant moment wrapped in grand emotion. It was routine, and that more than anything was the quiet proof of how far I had traveled from the life I left behind. I arrived at my parents' house the next evening without expecting warmth, apology, or clarity. The porch light glowed exactly as it always had, steady and rehearsed, as if the house were posing for a role it had played for decades. Mom opened the door before I knocked. Her expression was neither welcoming nor cold, just calculated. The kind of expression you wear when you're not sure which version of yourself will be most useful. "Dinner is ready," she said, stepping aside. The table held 3 plates, nothing more. No centerpieces, no carefully arranged linens. It looked modest, almost humble, a performance of simplicity designed to make me feel comfortable. I recognized the tactic. They had always been skilled at staging environments. I took the seat closest to the window. The quiet settled instantly, thick, but not hostile. Dad sat across from me, hands folded. Caleb lingered near the doorway for a few seconds before lowering himself into a chair, his expression neutral in a way that felt practiced. Dad broke the silence. "I watched the interview," he said, voice steady. "Your explanation of the system architecture was clear. I had our legal counsel verify the contract structure. The phased deployment is smart. It minimizes immediate liability, Grace." The words sounded like acknowledgement, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he had prepared these compliments the way you prepare talking points for a negotiation. "Thank you," I said carefully. Mom rested her palms lightly on the table. People called the house today. Reporters, colleagues, relatives. We told them we had no comment. I appreciate that. Of course, she smiled. We're family. The word hung in the air. Family. As if that single term could erase years of dismissal. As if saying it often enough would make it true. Dad exhaled slowly. You presented ideas for years. We dismissed them. That was a mistake. I can acknowledge that the decision to give Caleb oversight of your original prototype was based on my own outdated understanding of the technology landscape. He let the words stand, not softened, not padded with excuses. A clean admission. Too clean. I had watched my father operate my entire life. He never admitted fault without an angle, never conceded ground unless he planned to claim something larger in return. What do you want? I asked. Dad's eyebrows rose. Want? You didn't invite me here to apologize. You invited me here because my company just became valuable enough to notice. So what do you actually want? The silence shifted. Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom's smile flickered before resettling into place. Dad leaned forward. Grace, that's unfair. We're trying to repair what a relationship you never valued in the first place. I kept my voice level. You didn't call me once during the 3 years I was building Aurora in Denver. Not once. No birthday cards, no holiday invitations, nothing. And now that my face is on Bloomberg, suddenly you want to have dinner and talk about family? That's exactly what this is. I looked at each of them in turn. I'm not stupid. I know how you think. You're calculating how my success reflects on you. You're wondering if there's a way to position yourselves as supporters of something you actively tried to destroy. Caleb finally spoke. You're being paranoid. Am I? I turned to face him. 2 years ago, you took my prototype and rebranded it as your own project. You didn't improve it, you just put your name on it. And when it failed, you blamed the original concept instead of your execution. Now you're sitting here pretending you've always believed in me. That's not fair, Caleb said. I made mistakes. I've admitted that. You admitted it after you had no other choice. That's not growth. That's damage control. Mom's voice cut through the tension. Grace, please, we're trying. Can't you see that we're trying? Trying what exactly? I asked. To understand me or to figure out how to benefit from what I've built? The question landed hard. No one answered immediately. Dad spoke carefully. Both. I won't pretend otherwise. Yes, your success changes things. Yes, there are opportunities that come with that for all of us. But that doesn't mean the desire to reconnect isn't genuine. At least he was being honest, or honest enough. What kind of opportunities? I pressed. He hesitated. Caleb looked away. The foundation has been approached by several investment groups, Dad finally said. They're interested in partnerships that involve family businesses, your company included. There it was, the real agenda. So you want to use my success to leverage your own deals. I want to explore mutually beneficial arrangements, Dad corrected. There's nothing wrong with family members supporting each other's ventures. There is when those family members spent years tearing me down. I pushed back from the table. You don't get to dismiss someone for a decade and then show up asking for partnerships when they succeed despite you. Grace, I'm not finished. My voice stayed steady, but my hands were trembling. Do you have any idea what it cost me to build Aurora? The years I spent eating crackers for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries, the nights I couldn't sleep because I was terrified of failing, the relationships I destroyed because I was too exhausted to be present for anyone. I stood up. You weren't there for any of it. You didn't call when I got my first contract. You didn't congratulate me when I hired my first employee. You didn't care until the numbers got too big to ignore. Dad's expression shifted, not softening, but recalculating. He was adjusting his approach, searching for the argument that might still work. You're right, he said. We weren't there, and that's something we have to live with. But does that mean we can never repair the damage? Does it mean we're locked in this pattern forever? The question stopped me, because I didn't have a clear answer. Part of me wanted to say yes, that some damage was permanent, that trust once broken couldn't be rebuilt, that they had forfeited any claim to my life years ago. But another part, the exhausted, lonely part that still remembered what it felt like to want a father's approval, wondered if that was true. "I don't know," I admitted. Mom stood slowly. "Then let us try. Not for business, not for opportunities. Just let us try." Her voice sounded different now, less polished, more uncertain, like the mask had slipped enough to reveal something real underneath. Or maybe that was just another performance. I couldn't tell anymore. "I'll think about it," I said. Caleb spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not because you're successful now, because I was wrong. I was jealous and threatened, and instead of dealing with that, I took something that wasn't mine." I studied his face, searching for the angle, the manipulation. I couldn't find one. That didn't mean it wasn't there. "I hear you," I said, "but hearing isn't the same as believing." He nodded slowly. "I understand." I walked toward the door. Before I reached it, Dad spoke one more time. "Grace, whatever you decide, I am proud of what you've built. That's not a strategy. It's just true." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Maybe it is," I said, "but you'll have to prove it means something before I believe it." I stepped outside without waiting for a response. The cold air hit my face, sharp and clarifying. I walked to my car, slowly processing the conversation. They hadn't changed, not really. They had adjusted, recalibrated, found new ways to position themselves around my success. But underneath the adjustments, the same patterns remained. Dad still wanted leverage. Mom still prioritized appearances. Caleb still struggled with his own inadequacy. The difference was that I could see it now. The manipulation was transparent in a way it never had been before. That was progress, not for them, for me. I drove home with the windows down, letting the cold wind clear my head. The city lights flickered past, indifferent to my family's drama. Some relationships couldn't be repaired. Some people wouldn't change no matter how many opportunities you gave them. Some damage was permanent. But knowing that didn't mean I had to carry the anger forever. I could acknowledge their limitations without letting those limitations define me. I could maintain boundaries without burning bridges completely. I could accept that they might never become the family I needed, while still leaving room for whatever they could become. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just clarity. And for now, that was enough. I reached the office before sunrise. The city sat muted beneath a pale stretch of morning light, streets empty except for delivery trucks and early joggers. No cameras waited outside the building. No reporters lined the sidewalk. No family members stood at the door expecting answers. The world had returned to its usual rhythm. But I hadn't. Inside, the familiar hum of servers greeted me, that constant mechanical heartbeat I had grown to love. The dashboard glowed green. System stable, traffic managed. Everything functions exactly as designed. I should have felt satisfied, triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I felt empty. Not depressed, just hollow. Like the adrenaline that had powered me through the past month had finally drained away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and questions I didn't know how to answer. May found me in the conference room an hour later, staring out the window. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I haven't." She sat down across from me. "Want to talk about it?" "I don't know what there is to talk about." I kept my eyes on the skyline. Everything worked. The pilot is proceeding. The contracts are expanding. The valuation is climbing. I should be celebrating. But I keep wondering if any of it matters. May was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I spent years building Aurora to prove something, to show my family they were wrong, to demonstrate that I was worth more than they believed." I finally turned to look at her. "And now I've done that. They've seen the numbers. They know what I built. But it didn't change anything. They're still the same people, the same patterns, the same limitations. Did you think success would fix them?" Maybe. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I believed that if I achieved enough, they would finally see me, really see me, and once they saw me, something would shift. I laughed softly. "Stupid, right?" "Human," May corrected. "Not stupid." I rubbed my eyes. The worst part is, I'm not even sure who I am without that chip on my shoulder. I've been fighting so hard for so long that I don't know what I'm supposed to do now that I've won." "Have you won?" The question stopped me. "The company is successful," May continued. "The contracts are signed, the numbers are real, but is that the same as winning as external validation, the finish line you actually wanted to cross?" I didn't have an answer. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings and decisions. The federal pilot entered its second phase. A major European partnership moved forward. The team expanded to handle increased demand. By every external measure, Aurora was thriving. But internally, something had shifted. The hunger that used to drive me felt muted. The satisfaction of solving problems felt temporary. The victories felt hollow in a way they never had before. One evening, I found myself sitting in the empty office long after everyone had left. The city lights glittered outside the window, beautiful and indifferent. I thought about everything I had sacrificed to get here, the relationships I had neglected, the experiences I had missed, the parts of myself I had suppressed in service of a goal. And I wondered if it had been worth it. Lena's resignation still haunted me. I had sent 3 emails asking if she would consider returning. She never responded. Eventually, I learned she had joined a smaller startup, one led by someone who actually listened to their team. I had tried to change. I had made the speech. I had committed to doing better. But the damage I had done couldn't be undone. Some consequences were permanent. That was the hardest part of success, realizing that achievement didn't erase the mistakes you made along the way. My phone buzzed. A message from Caleb. "I know you don't trust me, but I'd like to try again." "Coffee sometime." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to maintain the boundaries I had set, to protect myself from another disappointment. But another part remembered what May had said about human connection, about building people, not just systems, about the parts of life that couldn't be optimized or engineered. "One coffee," I replied. "No promises." His response came immediately. "That's fair. Thank you." I didn't know if anything would change. I didn't know if Caleb was capable of being a real brother. I didn't know if my family would ever become something other than a source of pain. But I knew that staying angry forever was its own kind of prison. The following week, the board called an emergency meeting. The European partnership had hit a complication, a regulatory hurdle we hadn't anticipated. Solving it would require restructuring part of our architecture and delaying the rollout by at least 6 months. The news should have devastated me. A year ago, it would have sent me spiraling into panic. Instead, I felt something unexpected relief, because the complication meant more work, more problems to solve, more reasons to stay engaged. And I realized with uncomfortable clarity that I didn't know who I was without a crisis to manage. "We can handle this," I told the board. "It's a setback, not a failure." They nodded, reassured by my confidence. But underneath the confidence, I was asking myself harder questions. What happened when all the problems were solved? What happened when the company didn't need me anymore? What happened when there was nothing left to prove I didn't have answers? The morning after the board meeting, I took a walk through the city instead of going straight to the office. The streets were crowded with commuters, everyone moving with purpose, everyone chasing something. I stopped at a small park I had never noticed before. A patch of green between 2 office buildings, barely large enough for a few benches and some tired-looking trees. An old man sat on one of the benches, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. He looked up as I approached. "You look lost," he said. "I'm not. I know exactly where I am." He smiled. "That's not the same thing." I sat down on the other end of the bench, watching the pigeons cluster around his feet. "I built something important," I said, not sure why I was talking to a stranger. "Something I worked on for years, and now that it's done, I don't know what to do with myself." "Is it done?" he asked. "The hard part is." He tossed another handful of crumbs. "In my experience, the hard part is never done. It just changes shape." I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Building something is one kind of hard. Living with what you've built is another." He met my eyes. "The second kind is the one that gets the most people." I didn't respond. I just sat there watching the pigeons, letting the truth of his words settle over me. I never saw the old man again. I went back to that park several times, but the bench was always empty. Maybe he was just a stranger who happened to say the right thing at the right moment. Maybe he was something more. I never figured it out, but his words stayed with me. Building something is one kind of hard. Living with what you've built is another. I had spent years mastering the first kind. The second kind I was only beginning to understand. The European partnership eventually moved forward. The regulatory hurdle was solved. The rollout proceeded 6 months delayed, but ultimately successful. Aurora continued to grow. The team expanded. The technology improved. The numbers climbed. But I stopped measuring my worth by those metrics. Instead, I started asking different questions. Was I treating people well? Was I present in my relationships? Was I building a life or just a company? The answers weren't always comfortable. I still struggled with delegation. I still worked too many hours. I still found it easier to focus on problems than people. But I was aware now. And awareness was the beginning of change. On the anniversary of the gala, 1 year since my name appeared on that screen, I took the day off. No meetings, no emails, no system checks. I drove to the lake outside the city and sat on a rock overlooking the water. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and orange. I thought about everything that had happened. The failures, the successes, the people I had hurt, the people who had hurt me, the family I might never fully reconcile with, the company I had built from nothing. And I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for months. Was I happy? The answer came slowly, honestly, imperfectly. Not yet, but I was getting closer. I had built something remarkable. I had proven that I was capable. I had achieved things my family said were impossible. But revenge wasn't the achievement. The revenge wasn't the validation. The revenge wasn't proving them wrong. The revenge was becoming someone who no longer needed their approval to feel whole. I wasn't there yet. There. Maybe I would never fully arrive, but I was on the path, and the path was mine. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from May. The team wanted you to know 1 year ago today, everything changed. We're proud to be part of what you've built. Thank you for including us. I pulled over to the side of the road, reading the message again. Something shifted in my chest. Not pride, something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Connection. The recognition that I hadn't done this alone, even when I thought I had. I typed a reply. I'm proud to be part of it too. Thank you for staying. Then I sat there for a moment, watching the stars emerge one by one. The company would continue. The challenges would continue. The relationships with my team, with my family, with myself would continue to evolve. Nothing was finished. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was perfect. But I was still here, still building. I'm still learning. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.